Welcome to Better Worlds Ocean, where we dive into discussions on cutting-edge technology, data-driven solutions, and groundbreaking innovations aimed at tackling oceanic challenges. Join us as we ride the crest of a new era in global sustainability and work together to preserve our oceans for generations to come.
Welcome back to Better Worlds Ocean Podcast, where we dive into the data, technology, innovations, and insights people are applying to today's ocean challenges. We're joined by Neil Davies today. Neil wears a lot of hats, so I'm going to let him describe and enumerate all of them. But he is someone who works really at the intersection of next generation technologies, communities, conservation, and even the edge of Web3. So I'm very excited to have him today to have these conversations. And even though he's not necessarily based in California, we are actually in the same time zone today. So welcome, Neil, from across the bay.
Thanks, Kate. Great to be here, and literally to be here in California, in San Francisco Bay. I'm downtown San Francisco right now. But as you say, I'm usually based on the island of Moorea in French Polynesia. So Moorea is just off the coast of Tahiti, where I've lived since 2000 now, so quite a long time. I'm originally from another island, a little less glamorous, England. I was born and raised in Oxford in the UK. But as I say, for the last 20 years or so, I've been with the University of California. I run the research station, the Gump South Pacific Research Station. I'm director there for the University of California, and that's the main hat that I wear. I'm also a research affiliate at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, and I'm part of Berkeley. The Berkeley campus is the operating campus for the Gump station. And I started off as a geneticist. I still am a geneticist. That's what my PhD was, in evolutionary genetics. And since I took over running the research station in Moorea, I've been exposed to a lot of different fields. I mean, genetics is already a pretty cross-cutting field itself, at least in life, because all of life, as we know it, has DNA. But really, I began to appreciate the importance of curating all of the data and knowledge that a research station like the Gump station is gathering, and that there wasn't really anyone dedicated to doing that for the place. Lots of the research programs, of course, manage their data to greater or lesser extents, but no one really had the responsibility, at least on the science side, for doing it for the in our case, for the island and the coral reefs around it. So I became very interested and engaged in data and data science and data curation, particularly from the origination of data, which is what we do in the field, in the natural sciences, generating new data, new scientific data, and the sort of value chain of how those data then flow around the world to various centers, and including, by the way, material samples that flow, which are a form of data that flow to other parts, to museums and labs, again, around the world, and get turned into data products and knowledge products that are then used, including, hopefully, presumably, by by the places from which they came. So sort of integrating that value chain is a really important thing, and a really important thing for us because we're at the beginning of it. We initiate a lot of that, and so I became involved in data science sort of more formally through the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, and we ran some pretty large scale projects which really needed that infrastructure. And I can talk more about some of those later. But in terms of a couple of additional hats I've added along the way, I am now also vice president of Tetiaroa Society, which is a non-profit organization that is the environmental steward of the atoll of Tetiaroa, which is a small atoll just off the coast of Tahiti and Moorea, so a short distance from where I sit in the Gump station. And thanks to a resort, the Brando, which is a very cutting-edge eco resort set up by Pacific Beachcomber, a company run by Richard Bailey in French Polynesia, that's really pushing the envelope in what it means to be a green, or in our case, a somewhat blue resort, with being LEED Platinum standard buildings and operations. And we have a small research facility there that is studying an atoll environment, and also where we have a chance to influence management because we're working directly with the stewards. Tetiaroa Society is as I said, the environmental steward of that atoll. And partly from that experience on Tetiaroa, we launched an initiative called the Blue Climate Initiative, which is taking some of the lessons that we've learned in French Polynesia. And if you play with Google Earth and center the world on Tahiti, it might give you a new view. It certainly did for me. When you center it on Oxford, where I grew up, you see a lot of land. When you center it on Hawaii, where I lived for a few years, you also still see a lot of land in the Northern Hemisphere. You see the United States, for example. But when you center it on Tahiti, you see almost no land at all. It really is striking what a blue planet we are on. And the heart of the Pacific Ocean is actually in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's somewhere around Tahiti. You can see a little bit of California, which is more or less the nearest continental landmass to Tahiti, so not that unusual. The University out of California has a presence on the island. You can see the Hawaiian Islands, of course, New Zealand, but the other continent you can see a little bit of is Australia and a bit of Antarctica. So we're sort of halfway between. Tahiti is located about halfway between California and Australia. So those are some of the
I want
hats.
to
So
go.
I'm
Oh,
involved in the Blue Climate Initiative as head of science and technology. Sorry.
absolutely. Well, you're in that heart of the Pacific blue planet, to be sure.
Yes.
I want to go back to that comment you made about coming in as the head of research station and having that change the way you thought about data and information, because that's something I think we hear more and more in ocean data science and ocean conservation is some of these shifting mindsets about how data should be tagged and organized and stored so that we can draw different insights from it. So for those of you watching who aren't as familiar with the ways of oceanography and the history of oceanographic science, there's often been kind of a divide between the people who do what's called blue water oceanography or big oceanography. They're out in ships, they're using satellites, and they're looking at data by type for large scale connections like weather patterns and currents and big scale connectivity that's so important to the ocean but doesn't necessarily tie you to the details of a location. And then you have very specific location data that field scientists and research scientists have taken over time. And particularly, maybe this never happened at your research station, but I can say with some of the research stations that I know and I've worked with, there can be almost forgetfulness about the importance of place. And so you'll go back over records and they'll say things like, this sample was taken near Point Bonita. And you're like, well, that's not really helpful as a location if I'm trying to link that to these other bits of data, particularly if I'm trying to link it to something like these large global data sets, because I don't have a lat long. I don't even have like a specific landmark. I just have kind of generally in this area. And we're finding that so much of what we need to know to take these next steps in ocean conservation is about this connection between global and local, and what can we do from a local standpoint that's really about the kind of stewardship that's going to contribute to global changes. And part of that is about understanding what data and information, including traditional and local and indigenous knowledge, can really tell us that's so grounded in a place. So you came in as a scientist and you said, what is going on with all of these, I don't know, Excel spreadsheets or whatever you were presented with as the data architecture, and what did you do?
No, well, you're exactly right. I mean, we are a coastal marine lab, but not only a marine lab. We also do terrestrial research on the island, but pretty much everything where we are is tightly interlinked with the sea. The land-sea connectivity is very evident. Uh, and as a physical location that's been invested in over the years, the research station was opened in 1985 on land donated to the University of California by a guy called Richard Gump. We've been studying this place and amassing scientific data and time series data, so data over time about how that place is changing with a view to understanding it for global scientific benefit and also obviously to specifically to be able to manage places like this better, to be able to inform decision makers, the local community with scientific data of what's happening and maybe how to change the trajectories if what's happening is not what the people of that place want to see. But as you point out, we absolutely also need to rely on global data that are gathered at larger scales. And there are two global commons more really on this planet. One is the ocean, that is a global ocean. It's all connected. And obviously the atmosphere, and the relationship between those two is incredibly important. What you do that affects the ocean or the atmosphere affects everyone on the planet. That's not so true about what you do on land, perhaps, unless it influences the ocean or the atmosphere. So those studying the ocean, oceanography, studying the atmosphere is a global activity. It's obviously a very large scale. So the satellite, well, I would categorize them more as the ex situ data sets that are generated about places without actually having to enter those places. I mean, literally, some of that is from space, so they're not even on this planet. That's one category of data, and they're really, really important. It gives you the big picture of. It's very difficult to understand what's happening on Moorea, for example, as a little island in the Pacific, unless you can see, the water sloshing around the Pacific basin, in big blobs of hot water are drifting out towards us, and suddenly all the conditions change on the island. And we didn't see that coming. Well, we now do see that coming because we have eyes on it from space. And to some extent, ocean research vessels and oceanography do a similar sort of thing. They move around, I mean, on the ocean in that case, and they're collecting data over large areas. And we absolutely need all of that, and it's been revolutionary. But we also need data that we can only gather from the places themselves, the in situ data, like genetics is a good example, because we cannot read DNA from a satellite. I doubt we'll ever be able to. We can get proxies maybe, but you can't actually read DNA without physically accessing the organisms, whether they're bacteria or animals or plants, or sometimes just accessing the molecules that are floating around. This is environmental DNA. But we need to access those and then sequence them, and that requires being in the place. And so in situ data is something that physically located, permanently located research facilities like ours are able to gather over time as observatories embedded in those places. And we need to connect the two. We need those aggregated up with all of the people doing the in situ observations obviously adds up to a global observatory. And that can connect with the ex situ satellite-based imagery and data to give us the complete picture, including when we need to zoom in to specific places and understand local dynamics.
You mentioned the genetic data, which is the foundation of your research and your background. And another thing that's changed, in addition to the new technologies we have around tagging and tracking data and doing data management, is that we now have much more sophisticated global policies and laws and frameworks around the protection of some of this data and information, including genetic resources. So there is a history in Western science of kind of extractivist or parachute science of people coming in, particularly to island nations, doing a bunch of research and then, taking it back to that less glamorous island of England or the United States or somewhere else, never sharing the results back or even taking physical samples and, not really getting permission to take those samples. But now we have things like the Nagoya Protocol and other international agreements that basically say very clearly that information and genetic information, genetic samples specifically, are the property of the people and the communities and the places where they originate and must be respected and treated in such a way that they're not just flown away, never to be seen or heard from again. So what kinds of things have you been able to put in place at the research station to make sure that critical research is still getting done and those protections are still in place for information and samples?
Yeah, those are great points. And well, one way of answering that is that on the property that maybe bizarrely the University of California ended up owning on this island, we have the scientific research labs, which were largely built thanks to investment donations from Gordon, recently deceased and fondly remembered Gordon Moore, who the founder of Intel, of course, who and a Berkeley alum, who supported the construction largely of the research facilities that we have, and more recently through the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So there was actually really interesting investment from the products of some of the science that's led to the technological advances in Silicon Valley, and investing in understanding the planet, which Gordon was passionate about, environmental science, and how we can conserve, particularly biodiversity. So on this property that has these advanced research facilities, the other half of the station property is dedicated to traditional knowledge and uh, understanding and documenting what was eroding the Polynesian understanding of those systems. And so that wasn't started by Berkeley, that was started by a local community-based organization led by Hinano Teavai Murphy, who was the idea of we're losing this traditional knowledge with the elders of the island. We need to start to document it before they pass away, and sadly some of them have since that effort was started in 2002. So it began with a garden, a community garden, and the plants and the Tahitian names of the plants and the uses of the plants, and sort of building up this database, really, which is what is it? It is a traditional knowledge database. That needs to be recorded. It used to be passed on through oral tradition. That was the only Polynesians had no written language at the time of European contact, so everything was passed down incredibly through an oral tradition. Of course, today, in order to pass that on to the next generation of Polynesians, we also need to leverage modern technologies, including digital databases. So that nonprofit organization, Te Puatetia, leads those efforts to document the traditional knowledge about the place, which is still incredibly valuable and pertinent to its ongoing management. So that engages modern science, if you like, with traditional knowledge. And people in French Polynesia, like around the world, want to use and leverage new technologies. People generally don't want to live in a museum. The culture evolves. It takes and uses what is available to gain new understanding about the natural world. And that's something I think science, at least natural science and traditional knowledge, share, is this observation of nature, in a very proximate, close way, trying to listen to the voice of nature, uh, understand what nature is saying, and to respond to that. And we have new technologies, we have new ways of listening to nature now, and that's incredibly powerful. DNA sequencing being just one of them, bioacoustics, for example, and imaging are others. And so we can now hear that voice more clearly, try to understand what it's saying, which is a lot of what scientists do. What does it mean? We have the data, but what does it mean? And that's incredibly important today, because unfortunately we can't just rely on what worked in the past, because the world is changing, the climate is changing, and what we used to do might not work anymore. Some of it will still be very valuable, but not all of it. So that was a long response to one part of your question about engaging and trying to make the science really part of giving agency to people about what are the priorities in a place, but also what are the priorities globally, because we do have to understand how climate is changing and how it's impacting people in order to develop some solutions, which will have to be at the global as well as the local level. Um, I On the other side of it, I think you mentioned Nagoya and protocol, global efforts to maybe correct some of the practices of the past, and those are also incredibly important. And the legal mechanisms are evolving. They create with them sometimes problems. I mean, even to correct extractive behavior in the past with applying property to things is sort of a strange concept in a way, because partly some would say that's the whole problem, is that we're putting we're privatizing everything and making everything someone's private property. And DNA, nature, used to be seen as a commons, and we didn't invent it, so how do we have the arrogance to claim it's our property? That is extractive in itself. So giving other people property power is not necessarily the best solution. Maybe we should be exploring more traditional, which was, I think, traditional to all human societies previously, this sort of commons concept, and economies that are based on commons, not purely on private or purely on public properties.
And there is a whole world of study and community of people focusing on data and knowledge as a commons, as a common property process. It's the work of the Eleanor Ostrom Center for Data and Knowledge Commons, and the other folks who I think are trying to pursue that approach to shared knowledge and shared understanding, as well as shared resources as part of this pursuit for working together. So I'm glad you raised that. Are there things from your perspective at the heart of the Blue Planet that you would love to have, new inventions you wish people could come up with, or things that you're particularly excited about? Like, what is it that you have stumbled upon recently, or that you're discovering now in your work that is just your favorite thing to think about when you get up in the morning?
Yeah, well, that might be not what everyone would find so exciting to think about, but
That's what this podcast is for.
That's true.
I mean,
So,
we're sharing all of those things because there's somebody out there being like, somebody else also gets excited about that.
yeah, that's the promise of the internet, right? You're not alone in these strange passions you have. No, I am. We've been laboring at this for a long time. I mean, the examples. Take genetics again. We started to try and understand this place. We really believe that we need to take a systems thinking approach to understanding how the world works, and also, I mean, a really humble approach in the sense that we will never understand how nature works. We'll never be able to interpret everything that nature is trying to tell us. But we can make attempts, and we're getting a lot better at it. And suddenly ignoring it would be really a crime. So we're trying to understand what nature is saying, and to do that, I believe you have to really concentrate on some places to really have an understanding of what a complex system, a complex social ecological system that is what we have today, how it functions, and how different perturbations to it, what impacts those have, whether they're human caused or natural, I mean, or not due to human actions necessarily. So, as in human medicine, understanding something as complex, vastly complex as the human organism is really a massive challenge, and requires lots of different scientific disciplines, and has lots of social and ethical and other consequences. So it's not purely a scientific challenge, but just on the scientific side, it's vastly complex, and we have to mobilize data, coming back to data, across lots of different fields, and to some extent lots of different scales, up from the cell and molecules up to the scale of our bodies, and of course how our bodies interact with the environment. So that's a vastly challenging, overwhelmingly complex system. But we made a lot of progress in addressing that through the use of what we call model organisms. We don't just study humans, even though that's what we really care about, most people. We also study things like Drosophila fruit flies, which very few people really care about, but some do a lot. Nematode worms, C. elegans. Some people are obsessed with those. Most people don't know what the hell they are, or why we should be interested, and why we spend hundreds of millions of dollars and euros and yen and other currencies on studying these weird little organisms. But we do it because all of life is related. We all have a common ancestor. We all share DNA, and understanding some of our simpler cousins can help us understand ourselves. Not entirely, but we can make quite rapid advances in those simpler systems. And so we set about doing that, as science did, deliberately. It wasn't an accident. People like Sidney Brenner, proposed C. elegans. We need to describe everything we possibly can, apply all of our technologies to understanding this little nematode, describe, genomes, map all its cells, which has been done and has led to a lot of major advances in medicine. At the scale of sustaining our planet, we need to study and understand the planet, sure. But just as we look at humans and fruit flies, we also need to look at some places that are simpler than the entire planet, and understand how those places function, and those lessons can apply to other places, the ones that are similar. But then, if we have a range of places, we have a chance of understanding a range of different systems. So we've been trying to develop this sort of model ecosystem approach, or social ecological system, which is really a time series of partly just documenting in great detail, providing a lot of data that other people can use, then open data, as in open science practices that other people can use to try and understand uh, how a place functions. And to some extent, it doesn't really matter what the place is. It's just that we need enough information about a system. And it's no good if we study the butterflies over here and the plants and flowers on some other continent. We're never going to understand how those two add up to something greater than the sum of their parts. We can only do that if we study the butterflies and the plants in the same place and everything else that goes on around them. So when we think about DNA, DNA doesn't mean anything. It's just a bunch of A's, C's, T's, and G's. A sequence is meaningless without the context from which that sequence came. So that means, what cell was it taken from? What organism was it taken from? Where was that organism in the world? And when? When was it there? So the sort of basic fundamental metadata that you alluded to, for DNA, for some questions at least, we absolutely have to have the lat long, right? Where it was on the Earth when it was isolated from nature, when that was, what time, date, and some other, lots of other information around it. Ideally, all of the information about what was taking place around that DNA sequence at the time. What was the temperature, the pH, if it's in water, all of these different factors could be really important then for answering questions. So metadata is a really important thing, and arguably, all understanding is really about how things relate to each other. Get into sort of philosophical debate about that, but the relationships between things largely probably defines the things themselves. So understanding what something is and what it's connected to is fundamental, and that basically means you have to have metadata. And a lot of the DNA sequences around the 2000s that you could find in open access, great, really important innovations of having global databases that were shared with everyone in the world, completely open. But there was not a lot of metadata around some of those sequences. You couldn't tell, as you said earlier, you couldn't tell where were they sampled. It was near point something or other. But that's not good enough. If I want to address this question, I need more information. So I ended up being part of the Genomic Standards Consortium, for example, which its goal was established to add better metadata to genetic sequences. My reason for getting involved with that was because of a project we launched on Moorea in the early 2000s to genetically sequence every animal, plant, quite a lot of the fungi, basically every organism visible to the naked eye, from about 150 meters deep on the coral reefs to the mountain tops, to build this parts list. If you want to understand a system, you probably need some reasonable idea about what are all the parts in the system. And we have very little idea, even just what species are present in just about every ecosystem on the planet right now, including the ones that are intensively studied, like Moorea. So we thought, and we had support from the Moore Foundation to do this, and it was an international collaboration involving local researchers in French Polynesia, French Polynesian Department of Research, for example, French. We're an overseas country of France, so there's French national labs. It involved Berkeley, it involved the Smithsonian, it involved University of Hawaii and the Bishop Museum to build this inventory of different the organisms present on Moorea, sort of building that genome, like the genome of the system. And we leveraged at that time a new approach, a new standard, which was a DNA barcode, which is kind of like barcodes in the supermarket, but a genetic tag that if you had that sequence, you could just scan it, DNA sequence, read it, and say, okay, this, refer to a reference database and say, oh, this is species X. So that project started to kind of one of the core initial components of building this model ecosystem approach. And I can say more with that. I'll stop for a second, but that led on to a lot of what you were also talking about, genetic resources. Like now we're taking the entire patrimony of an island and putting it into a freezer and a database. Should you do that? Who should do that?
I think
What are the
what you're
consequences?
describing is, yeah, it's what you're describing is such a phenomenal body of work that you and the communities that you work with in Moorea have been doing for not just the 20 or so years that you've been there, but for the generations and centuries before that, which is going so deep and detailed and specific in a place that you can do that scaling up to be a model for other places. You can reflect back that learning at a large scale, but also keep it very specific to where you are. And I think that's a maybe a good space for us to start to wrap up. It reminds me of this Mary Oliver poem piece that gets quoted a lot about instructions for living a life. You know, pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And some of the philosophy you're talking about, which I think is applicable to so much in the ocean and is arguably an argument for metadata as a little bit of, if I can say, the poetry about data. It's the way we talk about data and help it be connected to other data. It's our way of reflecting our own astonishment and sharing with others what we have, what we know, and saying, come join us. This is what I understand. Come and learn with me about it. And so thank you for joining us today, Neil, and sharing us all about the work that you're doing and the work that's going on in Moorea. And to everyone watching, find a place where you can dive in and get specific and then share what you learn. We'll see you on the next podcast.